Welcome to Igniting Change, the podcast where we explore innovation, industry trends, and how tech for good is solving the world's biggest challenges. Let's get into it.
We are stood beneath a solid sun, a pulsing field of fertile imaginations. See, we are writing from a future that arrived for everybody. We are safe now. Not momentarily, not just in spots, not just till we're not. It is a fact of our time, our agency, our legacy, our state of mind. Here, justice means my body is mine. When we knew the frostbit destruction of nights, infringed sovereignty, unnamed crimes, we were seen on the front lines. We turned up the light in every corner, every street, woke the neighbors, sent sirens into fields. We shook this house, our home indeed. We raged against the night, the cobwebs so pristine, the creeds, the decrees, the greed of dark tyranny. We stirred and streamed utopias unseen till it was safe for all to dream.
Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Igniting Change podcast. I'm joined today by Rebecca Shadwick, who is a campaigner for gender rights and justice at Oxfam. This is a special International Women's Day episode, so we are really excited to have you here, Rebecca. Thank you so much for joining us. This is our third episode, I believe, for International Women's Day with Oxfam. So just so grateful that you were able to make the time to come and talk to us again, because it's always a fascinating and educational conversation that we have. So thank you so much. Do you want to start by just introducing yourself, what you do, and kind of what your focus is on right now, particularly around International Women's Day for Oxfam?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me and for having us back again. It's really nice to see excitement about International Women's Day and about sort of feminist topics generally. I think it's very much needed. So my name is Rebecca Shadwick. I use she, her pronouns. I'm based in the UK, but from Canada, and I work for Oxfam International, as you said, as a campaigner on gender rights and justice topics. And in particular, I lead the work on bodily autonomy and solidarity. So it's a campaign called Personal to Powerful. And we launched last year. I think Amina was your guest last year, who was one of the authors of our kind of flagship report on this. And the campaign is broadly around solidarity and bodily autonomy, as I said, but particularly within that, including things like sexual and reproductive health and justice and queer rights. So real popular topics right now. So yeah, thank you for having us and giving space to these issues.
Yeah, of course. And I think it's, like you say, it's pretty relevant at the moment, the area that you're working in, and like so very needed and kind of insane. I think when I was talking with Amina last year, it'd been a year since we'd spoken, and we were like, wow, there's been a lot of change and some of it's not great. And again, a year later, I think, God, it's incredible that there is this space and the dedication for to have these campaigns in place for this kind of thing. But it's like, oh man, it is 2026 and we're still having to fight, and it kind of feels like almost the fight is needed even more than ever, and that feels a little disheartening. I think it's really important. I think hopefully what we'll talk about today is kind of why it's so important, but then also try and end on some hopeful. I love to sort of try to extract a bit of hope, because I know that I kind of need it, and I'm sure people listening will love to hear it as well. So when you talk about the campaign, so Personal to Powerful, and you talk about bodily autonomy, so how does that kind of work with justice, and how those two things coexist together?
So we would say actually that justice starts with bodily autonomy, that there's an inextricable link between them. So I suspect that people listening are familiar with the idea, with the kind of the growing global backlash, which is a backlash against feminism, it's a backlash against human rights, against equality, against diversity, all sorts of stuff. And feminists right now are really talking about what's at stake, obviously, and this future that we're fighting to build. And so when we think about that future and we think about justice, we don't mean justice as a question of laws or courts alone. We're talking, and specifically not laws and courts within oppressive systems. We're talking about justice in a kind of a much broader decolonial feminist way, an expansive liberatory kind of justice. So if we're going to have a just future with that kind of justice, we can't have that without bodily autonomy. So bodily autonomy, the bodily autonomy, let's say the sort of sovereignty over self, the ability to make choices and decisions about your own body and your own life without coercion, discrimination. Without that, we can't have a just future. So bodily autonomy is the starting point. It's the root of this sort of just feminist future. So that means everybody everywhere has to have full control over their own body, their own life, their own choices, without fear, without discrimination, without coercion. And it's from that point that we can talk about having justice, about having a just future. And this bodily autonomy, this right to ourselves, essentially, that and LGBTQIA plus rights, those are fundamental human rights. Those are central to dignity, they're central to equality, health, privacy, freedom, all of these things. They're really foundational. So that's what we would mean when we say justice starts with bodily autonomy. And this has been something that I think feminist and queer movements have been saying for a long time, right? Like, it's not news. Maybe to some people it's news, but it shouldn't be. Feminist and queer movements have been saying this for a long time. They've been fighting for this right to ourselves for ages, right? For exactly that reason, because it is foundational. It's the root of feminist justice. And we've seen a lot from that push, right? The kind of history of feminist and queer movements. It's driven measures to tackle gender-based violence. That activism has driven like the repealing of harsh colonial era laws that punish queer people. Those movements have always been at the forefront of trying to reclaim that right to our lives. So we're standing alongside that. We're not saying something new here. We're very much standing in solidarity with and alongside feminist and queer movements, saying we need the full realization of bodily autonomy, of queer rights. We need to actively dismantle these anti-gender and anti-rights laws and policies, and narratives. And once we've got that, then we can have these communities rooted in collective liberation. We can have shared equity. We can have freedom from patriarchy. And that's where we have this just future rooted from. So we're standing in solidarity around the world and just pushing that message forward together, that this is really central to having this just future, right? Bodily autonomy, access to sexual and reproductive justice, equitable access to information, services, support that empower people, individuals and communities to make autonomous choices. That's the vision.
Nice. Thank you so much for that. And I think one of the things you said there about like, it's not new, this isn't new news, right? This isn't like a new crazy topic that's just come out of nowhere. It is, this is a pretty old one. And I think it is, like you say, it's the foundation of it all, because if you don't have that, then you don't have anything to build on, right? It's, that's such a core starting point, and it feels like it's a pretty low baseline. I feel like it's a really sort of like, it shouldn't be this much of a struggle, but it is. So it's so important. And I think a really interesting thing for me, we work in the tech industry, obviously, and the change in there as well. So you've got this isn't a new argument about bodily autonomy, but so we need to kind of reclaim in terms of like the basics, in terms of sort of day to day. But then there's also this other factor, this kind of new layer to it of like the digital kind of bodily autonomy that's coming in terms of things like the metaverse and things like online and all of that kind of stuff, where it's like there's a huge amount of work that's going in on sort of around AI in like all the wrong directions, in terms of kind of like the new era of like, slut shaming and nude photos and all of that kind of thing, where women have massively suffered in the last few years in terms of their bodily autonomy, in terms of this new kind of trend for creating kind of not suitable pictures against their will. And now you don't even have to, I think it was revenge porn a few years ago that it was called, and now you don't even need to have access to that. You just need any woman that's got a public facing profile can then kind of be degraded. It's a really interesting thing. I think I've been reading about it recently in sort of the kind of the new age of misogyny with AI, and it's just been a really interesting, horrifying, harrowing piece. But yeah, just really kind of ties into that sort of bodily autonomy piece as well. It's an interesting kind of, interesting, but another new thing to worry about. So it's a thing where it's like an old argument, and then there's a new piece that's kind of coming in as well. So yeah, thank you so much. That's a really helpful kind of insight into that. And you mentioned about sort of a feminist future. So there's a campaign that Oxfam is running in terms of the letters from a feminist future. Can you talk a bit about that, and what is it about, and kind of what is the kind of feminist utopia, and what is Oxfam kind of trying to describe here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to talk a lot about bodily autonomy, and I think just to be clear, there's a lot under that umbrella of bodily autonomy. Like you said, it kind of crosses into several aspects of our lives, but specifically on my plate, or the things that we're worried about within this campaign, is a couple of areas of quite fundamental human rights that are unfortunately being very hotly contested by anti-rights groups. So sexual and reproductive justice and the human rights, basic human rights of people with diverse sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sexual characteristics, or SOGIESC is one of the acronyms for that. So I'm going to say queer rights is a bit of an umbrella term. But yeah, so sexual and reproductive health and justice and queer rights broadly are two particularly contested bits of very fundamental human rights that this campaign is concerned with. So just to put that out there before we dive in.
That's great, thank you.
Yeah, so I think we're collecting letters from the future from feminists. So we'll have started the episode off with a little clip from a three-part poem called You Should Have Seen Us Hoping by a performance poet that we work with named Nupur Azani. And I'd really encourage people to watch the video. We'll put links up and everything. We're collecting letters to the future, from feminist voices. So the idea is that we're pulling together feminist voices and visions from all over the world. So this is a collective pluralistic visioning exercise of what it would look like to have a truly just future, which is rooted in bodily autonomy for everyone. So really feel into what this future looks like, what it feels like, what it means for us. And the purpose is to remind us collectively of where we're going and what we're fighting for, and really to reignite hope and solidarity around it. Because I think there are a lot, I know there are a lot of queer and feminist movements working on this, and they've been working on it for a long time. And as you say, it's exhausting, right? Particularly with the sort of levels of fury around it right now. And I think there's a real importance to having that solidarity and to reaching across to each other and reminding each other of, hey, we're going to get there. Don't forget, this is this beautiful thing that we're looking to reach to. So we're building a library of those visions. We've got a microsite called Letters from the Future. We can share the link once it's live. It'll be live for International Women's Day. And we would really encourage people to look through it, share it with friends and family, and tell and retell these stories of a feminist just future, because it's part of the purpose of the exercise. It's kind of reclaiming the right to reimagine our future. I think there's a lot out there right now that gives us glimpses of the future or of potential futures, dystopias, as you said.
Mm-hmm.
And in a sense, it feels like the dominant voices under patriarchy, under capitalism, almost have an ownership over saying what the future.
Sorry,
yeah,
you're cutting out ever so slightly there. Are you
cool.
okay to just sorry, you okay to go back about 10 seconds?
Oh, what's 10 seconds?
I heard capitalism, if that helps.
Right. Yes. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So we're reclaiming the right as feminists to envision the future, to imagine the future. We're kind of recapturing imagination. I think there's a real sense out there that some people get to decide that future for all of us, right? Those dominant voices under patriarchy, under capitalism, the sort of tech bro, essentially, and wealthy white men in the global north. Kind of feels like they've got a monopoly on what the future is culturally. And it's really important to look at imagination and the kind of power of imagination as a radical feminist act and say, no, actually, we're reclaiming that. It isn't up to these people to decide the future. All of us get to envision that, to imagine that, to create it. It is as we build it. And I think there's something really important and radical to kind of pull back, and particularly now when everything feels really hard and really depressing. We know that these particular areas, so queer rights, sexual and reproductive justice, those are areas that the organized and very well funded sort of far right authoritarian white supremacist movements and figures are working really hard to dismantle, right? And we know, obviously, queer and feminist movements have been battling to save and expand those rights for a very long time. So it's kind of a key battleground for both solidarity and imagination. And I think this is, although the context and the rollback of rights is extremely grim and it can be really depressing and really exhausting, when we've got these coordinated anti-gender and anti-rights movements pushing all these regressive laws and policies and narratives, that gets amplified through media and through misinformation. And some of that is tech facilitated, but Tech is always a tool. It's about who's wielding it and how. And it is very much used by those forces to help expand that push, both culturally and politically, to control bodies, to restrict sexual and reproductive rights, to deny gender identity and expression, and really normalize stigma and violence. And of course, that disproportionately impacts women and girls and queer people and racialized minorities, immigrant communities, all of those groups. Right? So yeah, that's why we have to talk about it right now. But also this month in March every year is not just International Women's Day, but the annual UN Commission for the Status of Women. And that happens every March. And against this amazing global backdrop of the news, this year's theme is access to justice for women and girls. So it's a really timely conversation for access to justice. And again, not justice in a very narrow legal sense, because we know in our bones that access to justice is not the same as having a legal system, particularly when that legal system is part of a structure that denies autonomy and entrenches discrimination. So we're talking about the feminist justice, the liberatory justice.
Yeah. And I think that's so important, because it is, I think part of why it's so disheartening is when you know the kind of legal compliance like justice system is slow to move and isn't always on our side and is outdated and antiquated, you do rely a little bit on the sort of social and community norms to kind of be a reassurance. So when those start getting degraded, as they are, I feel like now, like you said about the sort of feminist backlash that kind of last, I think it was kind of before, but particularly the last 12 months, it feels like it's pretty aggressive, just in terms of what people are talking about and what's becoming normal to talk about and things to say. Irony of this is a podcast, but the thing of like, there's a lot of men with microphones who have a lot of opinions that are getting out in the world that are just, pretty shocking things people are saying. I think if they'd have said 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, would have been received in a way that was like, you can't say that, that's outrageous, that's shocking. And now people say things and it's kind of normalized. And I think just because the volume and the amount of conversations that are going on, it just kind of feels like it's almost sort of battered down that resistance a little bit. So I think this idea of, using creativity and imagination to really reimagine a feminist future is so important, because I think it needs that kind of regrouping, like you say, like regalvanizing, to be like, no, okay, let's remember what, rather than just fighting against, it's like, remember what we're fighting for. Like, it's not just a case of defending and trying to hold everything in place. It's actually, we want to kind of rise up and actually have things improve. It's not enough to just maintain what we currently have, because that's not good enough. It's like, we've got to remember where we're trying to get to, so that we can kind of have a look at, making sure that we're doing the right things and we don't lose sight of that. Because I think when you lose that hope, I think that's kind of all is lost. And I do find it depressing. Again, I sort of come back to the tech backdrop from my interest in my industry. I think there's so much that's going on that's like limitless, and we can do anything with tech and anything's possible, and we can reimagine how the whole world works. We can, again, come back to the kind of the metaverse. It's like, we can, we're all going to be living online and it's going to be amazing, and AI is going to completely change everything. And you can reimagine everything. And it's like, they haven't, in that kind of mindset of completely blue sky thinking or whatever, they're not then thinking, and what could that mean for vulnerable people and women and, queer rights? What can that look like? Because we can reimagine it. It can start again and create this brave new world. And it's like they're baking in all of these horrible injustices that are already bad and kind of making them worse. And I think the conversation around bodily autonomy and kind of the pop culture side of it, again, like podcasts and things you see on, Instagram and Reels and all the rest of it as well, is really insidious in terms of the way people are talking about it now. And again, we talked about this last year, but the sort of far right movements of the really kind of conservative and like going back to old values and like, oh, the world used to be amazing, and if we just went back to that, and women just wanted to look after their husbands and their children. And it's so insidious, because it's kind of, they're trying to present it in this way of like, soft life and all the rest of it, where it's like, oh, you just need to like indulge your feminine side, or what, like all this stuff that you kind of hear. And it's not directly saying, actually, what we want to do is take away all of your rights and, just kind of chain you down and keep the boot on the neck in terms of the patriarchy. It's just like, no, it's soft, it's lovely, it's what you deserve, it's great. And and the bodily autonomy piece, I mean, there's that horrendous clip that went viral recently around the kind of falling birth rates on a particular podcast that I won't mention by name, where they were like, what are we going to do? What does society need to do about the falling birth rates? And it's kind of positioned as this, like, women are causing all these problems by not just having loads and loads of babies, and it must be the women's fault, and all of that fun stuff. So yeah, I think it's such an important conversation, because again, it's that kind of thing that you listen to and you're like, am I hearing this? This is like Handmaid's Tale stuff. Like, what the hell am I listening to right now? So yeah.
No, I think you're getting to something that is really at the heart of the way that anti-rights narratives have expanded recently, the normalization of it, right? So 31 years ago now, we had the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, and thousands and thousands of feminist activists and world leaders in media, they all got together. They had this huge conference. It was like this epic achievement of feminist and queer movement organizing. There was an agreement that women's rights are human rights, like real basic, right? But it was on paper. World leaders agreed, people agreed. It was a literal global agreement that women's rights are human rights and that they deserve full human rights just like every other person. And that was in 1995. And here we are in 2026 arguing over it still when we'd already agreed it. So it does feel like a real regression, right? And I think there's a piece here where all of these very well organized and very well funded networks of anti-rights actors, they've kind of moved from being at the margins, essentially from being fringe weirdos, into capturing whole chunks of quite mainstream attention and space, both like in the public sphere and in decision making or institutional spheres. There's a whole sort of army essentially that has been beavering away at capturing public attention, public narratives, and public policy making, institutions, multilateral and state level, like really infiltrating everywhere. And a lot of it, as you say, is kind of couched in quite clever language. It could be dressed as human rights. So a lot of the kind of pronatalist fear mongering around population rights is often couched as like, oh, we just need to make life easier for women who want to have big families. We're taking care of. So it's often dressed up as protecting women. And there's an interesting crossover with the anti-gender stuff and the intense xenophobia and racism that you see from the rising fascist, authoritarian, white supremacist movements. And they will both claim to be protecting women. So they're protecting women from immigrants. They're protecting women from, predatory men. They're protecting women from, the horrors of having bodily autonomy and rights. But they've got this real, it's for your own good, right? And I think it's really important to notice and point out this hand-holding between the anti-gender people and the white supremacists. Like, it's real explicit that they've got the same playbook here, right? And I think we need to be noticing that and pointing it out. They're often the same people, or they get their money from the same places. There's a real connection between the two, and I don't think we can tackle them separately. So one of the reasons we talk so much about solidarity as the answer is because it's the same people behind a lot of these movements and fundings and networks. And so we really need to be getting everybody together. You can't say, oh, I care about my rights as a woman, but not, as a white woman, but not the rights of Black women, or not the rights of trans women, or not the rights of immigrants. Like, it doesn't work, because the villains are the same, and the kind of structural power balances that enable both those things and that help them normalize themselves, it's the same structures, right? It's racism, it's misogyny, it's capitalism, it's colonialism. All of those structures are working together to kind of form our society, right? And the people who are trying to kind of capitalize on our like kind of polycrisis context here and reassert that system, because it serves them really well, right? It's a racist, sexist, profit-driven system, and it serves the wealthy, it serves the men, it subordinates women, it subordinates queer people, trans people, marginalized communities, racialized communities. So they're doing this because it serves their interests. I think some of them genuinely believe it, some of them are just grifters, but it serves their interest to do that, right? And I think we have to call that out. It's not some sort of beneficial for your protection game. It's really well thought out, very intentional things, like positioning basic comprehensive sexuality education or queer rights, or even access to contraceptives and sexual and reproductive health rights, positioning those things as threats that they need to protect women from, that they need to protect white people from, that they need to protect, this sort of the nation, citizens only kind of concept, that they need to protect you from these terrifying threats like education and information and health services. And so those narratives that they're using, I think you pointed out, like they kind of position themselves as defenders of or advocates for this past that was so lovely. My question with that past, and in fact with the new tools like technology, is always by whom and for whom. Who is that past serving? Who is that tech tool serving? So this, this amazing soft past, yeah, it was great for a few white wealthy men, but not for everybody else. These amazing tools that everyone's excited about to build the future with, who's wielding them? For whom? By whom? And who is getting left out? And those are the questions that no one seems to want to be real honest about. And, these kind of narratives around what's so-called traditional, honestly, I mean, it's often an imagined past.
Mm-hmm.
Let's be real clear about that. What it calls traditional is often actually either imagined or a very narrow definition of traditional. So the idea of a traditional family or a natural family, it's sometimes called, like everything else is unnatural.
Worse.
Well, the kind of idea of this nuclear family, mom, dad, 2.4 kids, white picket fence, that's A, very white, very Western. Also B, really recent. Like multi-generational households were the norm for all of human history and still are in most places. And also there's loads of families that aren't mom, dad, and kids, right? You have all sorts of different parenting situations. That includes queer families, but not just queer families. So this idea of harking back to something that's traditional or natural, or A, it's racist, and B, it's often imagined. Like it's kind of fake. So yeah, so you've got this two-part thing of A, we're protecting you from these terrifying things like information and rights, and B, we're doing so in favor of or to herd you toward this real rosy picture of something that is actually only beneficial for a few people and isn't real. But I think we can trace that shift in norms. Like we can talk about institutional capture and laws and state level stuff, but we can trace that project to shift social norms and narratives. I mean, it's been there for a long time, right? There's always been people saying this new thing, it's going to break down society. But we can really see it in the expansion of things like the manosphere and these kind of related cultural niches, which used to be niche and are now terrifyingly expanding in the digital world, but also offline. So you mentioned technology that's getting used for gender-based violence, that completely restricts the ability of women, of girls, of queer people to participate in public life, much less, decision-making spaces. We don't really have to look much behind like headlines around technology platforms and new technology to see how every single new layer of tools, it's not tech that's the problem. Again, it's the people wielding and designing them. Every single new tool can be used for good or, as we've seen, rapidly twisted for violent use by misogynist actors, by racist actors. You see it socially and you see it politically, right? So there are still over 90 countries that have really explicit legal restrictions on bodily autonomy. That should be zero in 2026, right? It's been a while since we agreed that everybody gets human rights, but over 90 still. So that's criminalizing abortion, denying access even just to contraception, allowing child marriage or exemptions to child marriage laws, failing to criminalize marital rape, laws that criminalize queer people or people with different sexual orientations or gender identities, sex characteristics. There's 21 countries where abortion is flat out denied. There's 156 countries where you can't marry the person you love because of gender's identity. I mean, I think I don't know if I mentioned earlier, there are 23 countries where you need someone else, so a third party, to authorize access to contraceptive services. And that's not just like youth, that's women.
Right.
And in 39 countries, if you're an adolescent, you have to get judicial consent to get access to contraceptives. I mean, you can imagine how that's effectively makes it inaccessible, right? Nobody's getting that.
Okay.
So that's a lot of places where we can see those restrictions in political and structural spheres. And obviously, anti-rights actors are capitalizing on those and trying to expand those regressive laws, whereas feminist and queer movements have been trying to, with a lot of success historically, trying to fix that, right? To make sure that we actually have human rights for all enshrined in our political and legal systems.
Yeah. And I think when you say those horrendous stats, it makes me think what you said earlier about like, who does that serve? Like what benefit? What is the benefit of restricting this access? Like I don't understand the kind of justification that, is used across the board for that kind of restriction of women's, basic health and just kind of rights of vulnerable people that aren't kind of men, basically. It's so infuriating when you kind of go down and that piece of kind of just accepting it and being like, well, it's kind of the norm or whatever, and then you go, but why is that? Like, where is that stemmed from, and how are we still abiding by that? How is that still law in this day and age? Like, we can look back and say, okay, there was a time where that was acceptable, but a lot of time has passed since then. A lot has moved on. Like, I don't understand how people can still be upholding these kind of antiquated laws and saying, well, no, this is still the right thing, this is still the right thing. And then you, like you say, kind of come back to, but who is that the right thing for? Because there's no way it's the right thing for women to not have access to that kind of basic healthcare. It's healthcare. Okay.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting seeing it it's often sort of couched in language of sometimes of human rights, sometimes of decolonization. So I think this is something that's on last year's podcast, which I would also really recommend to people. But that use of quote unquote common sense language, of human rights language by these actors to say, oh, we're protecting tradition. This is actually pro-woman when we do all this stuff. This is in some cases we see the anti-rights actors kind of saying, actually, we're human rights or queer rights, something external to us, and rejecting those rights is actually us rejecting imperialism. So it's really interesting to see the kind of capturing of those discourses to kind of make it look nice, to make it look shiny, to make it look professional, this veneer of, oh, it's so sensible. It's interesting because actually some of the fights that feminist movements have been winning recently have actually been to undo really harmful colonial era laws. So it's this interesting kind of turning on its head of reality. So thinking now about some of the successes that feminist and queer movements have seen recently, a lot of them have actually been in undoing really harmful colonial era laws or acts. It's interesting to notice that actually the undoing of colonial things it's happening by feminist movements, not the anti-right.
Yeah.
You think about Latin America, where these movements have driven decriminalization of abortion in Mexico and Argentina and Colombia. So feminist movements they're achieving a lot, and a lot of it is specifically decolonizing. But it's interesting, and you see it with queer rights as well. So interestingly, there were laws in both Singapore and in India that were actually colonial era laws. It's called Penal Code Section 377A, which criminalized acts against the order of nature, essentially criminalizing queer people. Queer activists, feminist activists have managed to get those overturned. They finally overturned them. So 2022 in Singapore, 2018 in India. So again, it's this amazing lie that anti-rights movements have managed to build up, that they are somehow the protectors again of something kind of key to nationhood or sovereignty or something, something that rejects colonialism. Actually, feminists are out there doing that, not the anti-rights actors.
Yeah.
So we know that this is where the wins happen. And it's interesting to see this kind of veneer of respectability that anti-rights actors have adopted with some of the language around human rights.
And it shows again, like what you were saying earlier, in terms of how it's all interlinked. Like you can't just focus on, like the white feminist piece where it's like, oh, well, as long as my rights are protected, then I'm still a feminist. You've got it's the whole spectrum of everyone that's affected and how interlinked it all is, like you said, with sort of all the racism in there as well. So it just shows how much it's kind of, again, it's to their benefit. And I think it's that piece as well where it feels a lot like, kind of the restriction and kind of keeping people, I don't know what the word is. I mean, oppressed, I guess, the most obvious word. Just the reluctance to kind of reverse those, and the fact that we had to fight to get so much of that overturned, whether that is, human rights, anything to do with the racism and feminism. You think it feels like the people who benefit from it feel like there'll be a loss to them by people gaining more rights. It's like, well, if you gain, then I lose, as opposed to a kind of rising tide that raises all ships, where it's like everyone benefits from everyone having more rights and, not being oppressed. There's so much in that where it does feel like it's, especially at the moment with all the backlash, where it's like, I feel like there's a group within society that have had a very long stint in power, where they've had, you know, a lot of autonomy, and they've kind of run the world literally and figuratively. And, you know, now that there is this kind of rise in, or we've had this like trend in rising, you know, people gaining more rights, and it's all kind of was all going in the right direction in terms of a good trend. It feels like this backlash is from them going, too much, like you've got too many rights now, which is obviously absurd because it's nowhere near that. But, you know, it feels like that's the backlash, where it's like, no, actually this has gone too far, you've got too many rights, and that's just not on. So we're gonna really double down and go, you know, retreat back to the old days of really oppressing all of you back down, so that we can gain more power again.
And I mean, I heard this, and I'm not going to remember the attribution, but someone said that, you know, when you've lived fully immersed in privilege, equality feels like oppression.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're seeing, right? We're seeing people who have had power for so long,
yeah,
feeling really threatened by the idea of equality, like really fundamentally scared of it.
Yeah.
Because they've had that power. For anyone else to be equal, suddenly that's a horrifying thought. I'm being so oppressed by someone else having some rights.
Yeah, that phrase really did the rounds.
Well, I mean, the world has built entire structures to help protect exactly that, right? This sort of fragile need for supremacy, and they've built entire societies with laws and norms and stuff in order to keep that power, to really guard it preciously, and they're terrified of losing it. And that's, you know, again, it's not wild, but the threat here is what? Equality? Apparently. So yeah, and I think it's interesting because looking at some of the figures making those claims right now, it's gone too far. I think again there's a really important thing to notice about where some of this backlash is happening. I think historically, and certainly in the development sector, there's been this idea that development is sort of very one way, that it's unilinear, like unidirectional. And I mean, historically, even the idea of development and the word, right? There's this idea that it's a very kind of Eurocentric colonial view of progress, one direction. And I think as much as some people have tried to come away from that, it still really colors the world's thinking about rights and therefore about anti-rights. So I think there's kind of an implicit assumption, sometimes explicit, that, you know, this what sees itself as the hub, the colonial power, the global north, the west, however you want to call it, that this idea that that's where progress and improvement come from, and it kind of drives it down the spokes to the outer edges of its world, because of course it's at the center. This, you know, that progress kind of flows from one to the other, and everyone else is kind of catching up to the colonial power of the west, right? And I think a lot of people would say that they don't think that way, but it's so ingrained in our education, our speech, our society to think that way, and we don't always recognize it, but there is this inherent racism to that way of thinking. It's super pervasive, right? Someone said racism is the sea we swim in. You know, you're constantly bailing the boat out against it. It doesn't just go away once you know it exists. So I think a lot of people don't realize that we think that way. And there's still a sense, I think, in the global north or in the west that, you know, gender injustice, that the oppression of women, or that homophobia, gendered violence, that those are kind of mainly happening over there somewhere, right? They're somewhere else. Yeah, you know, there's a bit here, but it's not as bad as over there, where essentially, you know, where there aren't so many white people. That is completely what is implicit in those kind of conversations. And I think it's a false assumption. It's a really dangerous one. And I think it's actually really hampered our ability to recognize and talk about and cope with the rising anti-rights movements, because we've thought about it for so long. And I say this as, like, you know, cis white woman, but like we have thought about it so long as being a problem somewhere else. You know, we've got rights, those people over there don't. That it has prevented us from seeing just how big and bad the threat is of the anti-rights actors, and actually where they're often based. You know, we have been blind to our own backyards, thinking that it's a fight over there. And actually, we need to take a really long, hard look at where the financial and political power base for these actors are. It's significantly in global north countries, even where they have these kind of, you know, spin-off or associated movements and figures in other countries. A lot of the funding, the playbooks, the influence, it comes from the global north. Like, we need to be really honest about the links between like global north money and power and what presents itself as a sort of, you know, grassroots or locally based anti-rights movement somewhere else, because the links are absolutely there. And if we don't acknowledge that a lot of this anti-rights backlash is coming from our own backyard, like our white people in the West, our backyard, then we're not going to be able to cope with it properly. Like we're already struggling, right? We really need to recognize that. And it's completely linked to the rise in authoritarian figures and the money, where these things come from. There's a real clear link between the anti-gender movements, again, real loud, real rich in the North specifically, and the kind of misogyny that comes along with white supremacy. So people who are real keen on policing sort of who seems feminine enough, often like white feminine enough to sort of, who performs conservative gendered roles the right way or the white way. And those actors are, global North. A lot of the money's from the same places, a lot of the political influence, the tactics and playbooks, 100% coming from our own backyards. And finding maybe kindred spirits elsewhere, but really pushing and financing networks around the world, but from our backyard, right? So I think there's a few examples that are really useful from the Personal to Powerful report we put out last year. So there's a whole range of actors that kind of come under the umbrella of anti-rights movements, and they convene nationally, regionally, in multilateral settings in ways that cut across the kind of global north-south divide. But you can trace some of those links back to where the money comes from. Always follow the money, and where the power is. Yeah. So, there's some really major ones like the International Organization for the Family, the American Center for Law and Justice. Notice they all sound real academic and smooth. Juris, Family Watch International is real big. Citizen Go. Those are all actually based in the global North.
Yeah.
But they have extensive partnerships and operations across the global South. So the primary funders are actually the right-wing religious organizations and conservative actors. So, evangelical, Orthodox, Catholic strands of Christianity based in the US, based in Russia, based in Europe, and they build coalitions with regional organizations. So, for example, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. But like that money and those roots, they're in the global North. And together they fund think tanks and media and multilateral engagement to promote these anti-rights ideas in different mainstream spaces as though they are grassroots, as though they are global, when really they've got real strong roots in the North, and money. So you look at kind of the global links and the kind of language co-optation across the North-South divide. So I think it's really interesting to see the way those kind of strings are attached. And those are the people who are twisting this language of decolonization, of justice.
Yeah. Oh, that's grim. That is,
creepy, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's similar to what you were saying earlier about that, we're doing it for your own good, like we're protecting you. It's that like horrible thing of like, we know what's right, we know what's best because we are superior, because we have all this knowledge that you poor women or you poor people who aren't white men, you couldn't possibly understand because
but we've got you.
We'll look after you, and of course we will. And I think when we're thinking about this kind of imagined feminist future, I think that part of that presumably is that people have the autonomy to be protecting themselves and or at least contributing to how they want to be protected, as opposed to that kind of like savior, someone like rocking in and being like, don't worry, I've got you, and you're there like, please don't have me. this is terrible.
It's very patriarchal, right? It's really paternalized.
Exactly. And like you say, just the white supremacy, that white savior thing of like, don't worry, poor South people, we'll save you because we are evolved and we know what we're doing and we're so civilized. It's so grim and so insane to still be talking about it in 2026. It's just horrendous. So, but in terms of kind of taking that kind of hopeful approach, remembering the hopeful bit, we're gonna stick with the hopeful bit.
Yeah, let's come back to that.
Where does this kind of start? So you mentioned about how there's the horror is everywhere, even if we kind of are sort of conditioned to think, oh, it's not here, it's everywhere else. It's everywhere. But what about kind of the flip of that? Like, are there pockets of the feminist future anywhere that we can kind of look to? And where do we find the hope for this vision? Come, Rebecca, give us some hope.
Yeah, well, I think, no, absolutely. Let's talk about the flip side, right? So we talked about where some of the roots of this toxic anti-right stuff is. Let's talk about the other side. So where we see change happening, where we see, the thinking and the praxis of what it means to understand and pick apart and dismantle systems of oppression in a really holistic way. That's coming from feminists in the global south, right? That's coming from some of those wins I mentioned around, advances in fighting gender-based violence, autonomy and sexual reproductive health, repealing colonial laws that punish queer people. Like, we have seen time and time again that leadership that we really need, that lives in the global south, the feminist and queer movements. So if we look at that for our leadership, we orientate ourselves around those movements, around their leadership, their knowledge, their experience, their expertise. We need to recognize that, but not just recognize it. We need to shift the kind of power imbalance that has always kept those voices and that experience out of decision-making spaces, out of that suppressed or minimized that knowledge. Because it keeps that leadership out of decision-making spaces, but also it excludes them from resources. So that shift is in recognition, but it's also in a shift that we need in power, a shift that we need in funding. It's not just saying like, oh, very nice, leaders over there, but actually putting our money where our mouths are. So we need to try and steer people who have money, people who have power. So states, but also, through aid financing, through philanthropy, whatever it might be, the power and the money really needs to reorient both to funding, the funding and the decision-making power, to put that in the hands of feminist and queer movements, because they've been doing this work for so long.
Yeah.
Like, that's where the expertise is, right? And particularly those in the global south, again, thinking how bad we've let the problem get in our own backyard in the global north. We need to be learning from places that have been like, chipping away at those oppressive systems. That's the leadership we need. So there's a few things that I think, we can say would help reorient the kind of power and money around those who are already leading that work to defend rights, to defend autonomy. It means that donor governments, for example, non-government bodies like institutes, funds, we need to prioritize funding that strengthens those movements so that they can hold governments accountable, advocate for rights-based policies, implement programs that protect autonomy, the work that they're already doing, but usually on a shoestring, right? So obviously prioritizing that funding. And that needs to be multi-year flexible funding to feminist movements who work on autonomy, who work on queer rights, who work on sexual and reproductive justice, especially those ones that are challenging anti-rights actors and coordinated attacks on gender justice. And I think, we also need to monitor and measure and report on the impact of official development aid on gender equality, because so little of it goes to that now, like tiny percentages. And it's dwarfed by the funding that other actors are pouring into anti-rights and anti-gender movements. So we really need to get stringent about making sure that aid is actually spent on gender equality and given to feminist movements, and directing those resources towards independent feminist and queer media outlets as well, to challenge the kind of mainstream anti-rights narratives that have really managed to capture quite a lot of mainstream media space. And that kind of comes back in a way to storytelling, right, and feminist imagination. We need to get money to the people, funding, support, resource, solidarity to the people who are already doing that work. And we need to tell those stories loudly over and over again of what success looks like, of the wins, of the future that we're building. And we need to carve out space in public and policy spaces to hear that story told again and again, to kind of to displace the disinformation.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's so interesting, the storytelling side of it, because I think it is when you're talking about kind of fighting against the kind of what's going on and trying to fight to maintain the rights. I think it's aggravated because it has to be, because that fight needs to be fought. But then I think when you do take, when we sort of got the brief for this and talking about what Oxfam's doing this year, when you actually stop and go, well, what does good look like? What does a successful feminist future look like? I don't know. I mean, maybe some people, but it doesn't feel like people are pushing for like the flip of what we currently have. It doesn't feel like people are going, well, you know what we want? We want to subjugate men. We want to like batten down white men and make them suffer, and talk about kind of like dehumanizing men in the same way that many men have dehumanized women for so long. I feel like that's not what good looks like to so many of these organizations. It's not about kind of, oppressing like, straight white men. That's not what it is. And I think when you look at what people envision, and I think that's where this campaign will be so powerful, of like, what does good look like to people? What does a good, positive feminist future look like, where, you know, you have kind of equal rights for everyone, and we have stripped out the, you know, the racism and the homophobia and all the gender violence and all the bad stuff? What does that look like? And I think it's that thing again where it's like, it doesn't mean that you in power lose all your power and you're subjugated, your you know, the boot goes on your neck. That's not what we want. It's not misandry. I mean, maybe some days, but like, you know, that's not what good looks like. What good looks like is the equality, like you say, like earlier, you know, like, oh, that's the threat. The threat is equality, and like a nice, lovely world that prioritizes protecting vulnerable people and, you know, prioritizing care and well-being, and looking beyond, like, say, the global north for influence of like, what does good look like? What can, you know, power in a different way that isn't just patriarchal and capitalist look like? You kind of imagine the letters in the different kind of forms that they'll be submitted. You'll read them and there will be so much positive and so little kind of violent and negative that you just think, why wouldn't you want that? How, what? But, you know, it's because of who it serves again. I think it's a really positive thing. I think it's really inspiring. I was kind of looking into it and having a think about it, and, you know, kind of thinking myself about what that would look like, you know, what that would look like for me. I'm raising a 10-year-old boy on my own, so our family is not the typical kind of 2.4 kids and married with a picket fence by any stretch of the imagination. You know, and I think for him, like him growing up in this kind of feminist world as well, it's kind of like, well, what does that look like? And it's just such an interesting thing. So I'd definitely invite anyone that's listening to, like you say, we'll put the links in, to go and read these letters once they're published, because I think that will be so inspiring. And it is such a, nice is a terrible word, my English teacher would be listening and turning in their grave, but, you know, it's such a wonderful change from that exhaustion and depression that you have when you think about like fighting the feminist fight, when you kind of do the flip of it and think about the sort of nirvana kind of state. It is really inspiring, and it is really hopeful, that vision of like, oh, that's what that could look like. And I think that is really kind of galvanizing and very optimistic and very different to the world that we have now, I think. So, I mean, in terms of kind of getting to this feminist future, just to kind of close out, are there kind of concrete practical steps that people can take? Or, I mean, hopefully there are. Can you talk about what those are, and how we can kind of turn that hope into kind of real action that will benefit everyone?
Yeah, I mean, benefit everyone is the key. Feminism really is about making a better world. It's not, as you say, it's not misandry. It's specifically about unpicking systems of oppression, multiple systems of oppression, not just, you know, on a gender axis. And it's about reimagining a world that isn't built on those kind of power hierarchies around race, around gender, around disability or ability. It's about unpicking oppression and remaking the world. So it's very much for everyone. And it can be, you know, when you think about that and you think about this future, it can be really depressing, right? To think about the kind of future that these kind of toxic actors are pushing for us, for our kids, for our planet. But that is, you know, that is why we have to build up each other, build up these stories, and tell and retell those stories of the future we do want. You know, kind of speak it into being. There are some very specific, like, concrete things that we can do kind of as a society to start turning that tide on the kind of government or like policy level. We really need to start holding leaders to account for taking action against or countering these regressive and oppressive discourses. Some states actively, full-heartedly endorse them, right? We really need to start calling our leaders to account, you know, not addressing these discourses, not addressing these actors. That's a breach of human rights obligations. It erodes access to justice, it weakens the rule of law. Like, we have to start holding our leaders to account on that. You know, we've repeatedly called on governments to ensure full bodily autonomy, but there's specifically, everybody needs full control of their own bodies, right? That's women, that's girls, that's people of diverse sexual orientations and gender identities, that's people of marginalized, racialized communities. Everyone needs full control over themselves. So that includes that everybody, including in emergencies, but states have to ensure that everyone can access sexual and reproductive health services. It's not enough to have the services, access to them, actual access, that's critical. So that includes contraception, it includes emergency contraception, it includes safe abortion, post-abortion care. That has to be available to everybody, and it has to be available without parental or spousal permission, without judgment, without discrimination, without coercion, without violence. Everyone has to have access, proper access. You know, abortion obviously is part of that, has to be decriminalized.
Yeah.
all the legal administrative barriers to safe abortion and post-abortion care, we have to get rid of those. It's not just decriminalization, it's making sure it's accessible, and that it's high quality services. Again, emergency and non-emergency settings. We have to make sure, and this is on states have to make available universal access to accurate, comprehensive sexuality education, including content on gendered power dynamics, right? It helps people learn skills for healthy, consensual, safe relationships and sex. So, I mean, that's a big bugbear of anti-rights organizations, but we really do need, honestly, just accurate scientific information and information about healthy relationships. We need laws and policies that protect everybody. And that means that people of different sexual orientations and gender identities, they have to be protected in national law. And that means decriminalizing consensual sex between adults. All of the laws that criminalize that right now have to be repealed. And we can't see culture or tradition or ideas of what is and isn't family being used to justify discrimination and violations of rights. Obviously, favorite tactic. Governments have to push forward on policies that challenge like gender norms and gender stereotypes. So that kind of comes all the way into aspects of things like unpaid care work that mainly fall on the shoulders of women and girls and marginalized groups, because that limits their opportunities, right? That's gonna limit their opportunities for full, healthy lives and autonomy. So it is quite far reaching.
Yeah.
And we really have to see those leaders actively challenging the anti-gender and the anti-rights narratives, right? They have to support independent journalism and free press. They have to make sure that there's evidence-based public communication strategies. They have to address misinformation that is fueling stigma and violence and structural discrimination. And that includes, protecting people from online harassment and abuse, obviously a big area of law for most of the world to be catching up on, as you've noticed. So there's a lot of like real obvious things that we've been calling on world leaders to do for a long time as feminists around the world. And we really have to hold leaders accountable for doing those things. They're real concrete, they're obvious. Feminists have been saying them for a long time. So I think it really is about holding power to account for that. And again, feminist, queer, grassroots movements for justice, especially in the global south, leadership and praxis, that's where it lives. So making sure that their work to hold people to account is something that we're standing in solidarity with, that we're reorienting power and support for. And then that's all kind of policy level, but looking kind of socially, individual, community level, we know that anti-rights and anti-gender movements work a lot through division and fear. So again, that kind of protection narrative and trying to tell us that the rights of one group are a threat to our own. Again, the same playbook between transphobia, xenophobia, sort of fear of, contraceptives.
Yeah. Terrifying pill.
Terrifying, right? But, the idea that women having rights or trans people having rights or people a different color from us having rights, that is somehow going to threaten our lives or, dismantle our nation in some way.
Yeah.
So there's a lot that, yeah, exactly, that is a threat to us, right? I think we can notice those links between those different toxic actors. We can talk about those links. We can absolutely deny that division and fear, right? So we refuse to be afraid of someone who is different. We refuse to be divided from someone who is different. We say, no, solidarity is the answer. Those different struggles around the world, those are all connected if they're against oppression. And so, yeah, it matters to me if someone who isn't the same as me is being oppressed, because it's going to be the same actor with the boot on the neck, right?
Exactly.
So, the kind of success that feminist movements in the past have had and presently, it's because they're able to bring together different coalitions and partnerships, right? It's because of feminist solidarity that they've been successful. Diversity and solidarity is the strength of feminist action and feminist change. So, our little part as Oxfam is to just be one of those voices in solidarity, right? To call to others to support their momentum, to unite in solidarity with those movements that are already leading this pushback and advocating for these changes. So that would be our call, would be solidarity. Refuse the division, refuse the fear, and use your imagination on the future, because that is a radical act. It's a political act to imagine something different.
Yeah.
So do that, right? What would it be like if? Talk about the story of the future you want, tell it to each other, invent it together, speak it into being, and like find the places and find the movements who are already chipping away at making that dream come true and be in solidarity with them. You know, everybody really, this is the dream, right? Everyone has access to total control over their own body and their own life choices. And that's, you know, who you're with, what path you take, planning for the future. So in the name of radical imagination and solidarity and hope, let's keep dreaming. Let's keep building that future.
Amazing. Let's end on that, because that's lovely and positive and hopeful, and yeah, real sort of concrete steps in terms of what can be done when it feels a bit hopeless to kind of actively hope. So Rebecca, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. It was such an interesting conversation, and we'll post all the links for the Oxfam campaign so that people can go and check it out and take those active steps. But yeah, thank you again. Really appreciate it.
We are writing from a future where we made home out of hope. Man, you should have seen us hoping. How we took to it day by day, an obligation to each other, saying, hey now, come on now, it'll take what it takes. We seep from the margins to mains, crowded the veins of systems designed to choke out our autonomy, the root of justice. Look at us now. We wove accountability into community. We shared knowledge of our ancestors. No gates, no gatekeepers. Ousting powers from rooms we were never meant to enter. We sprouted rituals of liberation. Chants rising, revising, reviving, despair turned rage, turned into collective care. Now there is confetti, even sun in our hair. We practice this future into being ours, no comrade left behind, no master to mind. You should have seen us coming, man. You should have seen us hoping.